August 19th, 2026. Mark that date, because in some time, it becomes the day the United States slaps an extra 50% tariff on $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Alcohol, dairy, electronics, even hockey sticks and cement. 554 separate tariff lines, all hit at once. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. Canada isn't scrambling to avoid it by giving Washington whatever it wants. Canada is walking into these final weeks and saying, in plain terms, not like this. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at an aluminum plant in Saguenay, Quebec, and told the country and the White House that Canada is not interested in a narrow, piecemeal deal that lets the U.S. cherry pick which tariffs get lifted while leaving the rest of the country exposed. He wants a comprehensive deal or no deal at all. That's not a negotiating tactic buried in a press release. That's a prime minister looking down the barrel of a tariff deadline and refusing to blink. So, how did we get here? And why is this the moment the United States might actually have a bigger problem than Canada does? Let's break it down. Before we continue, subscribe to Capital Current channel for daily updates. For years, the thing holding Canada, the U.S., and Mexico together economically wasn't friendship. It was paperwork. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, or CUSMA if you're north of the border, was built with a built-in checkpoint. Every 6 years, the three countries have to sit down and decide, do we extend this thing another 16 years, or do we crack it open and renegotiate with no fixed end date? July 1st, 2026 was that checkpoint, and the United States chose not to extend it. Let that sink in for a second. This is the agreement Donald Trump himself signed during his first term, and once called the fairest, most balanced, most beneficial trade deal ever made. Now, his own administration walked away from renewing it. Trade analysts are calling this the start of a slow-motion wind-down one that could drag on for a decade, with the whole framework potentially expiring for good by 2036, unless somebody rebuilds it from the ground up before then. And then, just to remove any doubt about how the administration actually feels, Trump went on Fox and Friends by phone in late July and was asked directly whether he wanted to preserve or update the deal. His answer, "I don't care," followed by, "I don't really want to." Think about the position that puts Canada in. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has been flying to Washington week after week, sometimes twice in the same 2 weeks, trying to hammer out an agreement with an administration whose own president just told a national television audience he doesn't actually want one. That's the asymmetry defining this entire moment. One side scrambling to save a framework, the other side shrugging at whether it should even exist. Here's where it gets interesting, because new trade rules isn't just a headline. It's literally the strategy coming out of the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Jameson Greer, the man running trade policy for the administration, has said openly that instead of trying to rebuild the entire USMCA, which would require going back to Congress for approval, he wants to negotiate separate bilateral protocols layered on top of the existing agreement with Canada and with Mexico, individually. Translation, new terms, new obligations, without the usual democratic guardrails of a full congressional vote. And what exactly is Washington asking for? 2 big buckets. Bucket 1, change the rules of the game itself. Tighter rules of origin, meaning stricter requirements for how much of a car, a product, a piece of machinery actually has to be built in North America before it avoids tariffs. The stated goal is boosting American manufacturing and keeping Chinese components out of North American supply chains. Bucket 2, change how Canada runs its own economy. Greater access to Canada's protected dairy market. An end to Canadian retaliatory tariffs. And this is the one that really lit a fuse, a demand that Canada stop pursuing any warming of ties with China. That second bucket is where new trade rules stop sounding like trade policy and start sounding like something else entirely. A demand that a sovereign country restructure its own domestic protections and foreign relationships to satisfy its neighbor. If you're not from a farming community, supply management might sound like bureaucratic wallpaper. It isn't. It's the system that protects Canadian dairy, egg, and poultry farmers from being wiped out by a flood of cheaper American product. It's politically untouchable in Canada for a reason. Every party that's tried to trade it away has paid for it. So when word got out that Ottawa and Washington were trading detailed proposals with dairy market access sitting near the center of the swap, dairy farmers of Canada didn't wait quietly. They came out publicly and told the federal government in no uncertain terms not to offer any more concessions on dairy or supply management. Not one more inch. And this is where the Canada refuses storyline gets real texture, because it's not just Carney at a podium. It's premiers who have to sign off on procurement and alcohol provisions. It's farmers organizing. It's provinces that pulled American liquor off store shelves in the first place and can't simply be ordered to put it back because in Canada, alcohol sales are a provincial responsibility, not a federal one. Even if Ottawa wanted to hand Washington an easy symbolic win by restocking American whiskey and wine, the Prime Minister literally doesn't have the constitutional authority to do it unilaterally. That's not stalling. That's federalism, getting in the way of a deal. And it's one more reason this negotiation is messier and slower than the White House might like. If you want one image that captures where this relationship stands right now, it's the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This is a $4.5 billion piece of infrastructure connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, the biggest cross-border construction project in decades, named after arguably the most beloved hockey player either country has ever produced. It was supposed to be the feel-good symbol of everything Canada-US cooperation represents. Instead, it became a flashpoint. Trump had floated blocking the bridge from opening at all, and reportedly wanted 50% of its ownership and toll revenue, despite the fact that Canada paid for its construction and ownership is constitutionally shared with the state of Michigan, not the federal U.S. government. When the bridge finally opened on July 27th, the planned joint ribbon cutting was scrapped over the trade dispute. So Canada held its own ceremony instead. Ontario Premier Doug Ford showed up in a Team Canada hockey jersey with Gordie Howe's number 9 on the back. Trump characterized it afterward as Canada having disinvited the United States. Carney's response was simple. Canada built it, and ownership was never solely America's to claim. A bridge built to unite two countries physically opened as two separate events on two separate days because the trade relationship couldn't hold together long enough for one ribbon and one pair of scissors. Now here's the twist that's been driving Trump the most furious over the summer. China. Carney made his first official visit to Beijing earlier this year, meeting with President Xi Jinping. The two sides reached an agreement to roll back some tariffs that had built up over the past couple of years, including allowing up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually at a reduced tariff rate of just over 6%, down from a full 100%, Trump did not take that well. He threatened a full 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Ottawa moved forward with what he characterized as a free trade deal, with Beijing going as far as posting on social media that China was taking over Canada, and reviving his old habit of referring to Carney as governor, a not-so-subtle nod to his repeated suggestion that Canada should simply become the 51st state. Carney's response was direct. Canada is not pursuing a free trade agreement with China. What happened with Beijing was a narrow fix to specific tariff issues, not a broad trade pact and under the existing USMCA framework. Canada is obligated to notify its North American partners before entering any free trade agreement with a non-market economy like China. Carney said flatly, "We have no intention of doing that with China or any other non-market economy." But here's the deeper issue for Washington. Canada adjusting its relationship with China on its own terms, even in a limited tariff rollback kind of way, is a preview of what happens if the U.S. keeps treating its closest ally like a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be negotiated with. Every threat, every tariff, every 51st state jab pushes Canada a half step further toward diversifying who it trades with. And once that shift starts, it doesn't reverse easily. Here's the thing American commentators tend to skip past. This isn't a fight where the U.S. holds all the cards and Canada just has to eventually fold. Canada is the #1 export destination for 36 different U.S. states. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.7 billion in goods and services crosses that border every single day. The Windsor-Detroit corridor alone, the one running right past that bridge, handles hundreds of millions of dollars in trade regularly. American automakers like General Motors and Ford run supply chains that cross the Canada-US border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished, meaning tariffs don't just hit Canadian companies. They hit Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana just as hard, if not harder, because American manufacturers eat the cost too. And then there's the boycott. Since early 2025, everyday Canadians have been quietly rewriting their own shopping habits, skipping American products at the grocery store, canceling vacations to Florida and Arizona, choosing Canadian brands out of sheer national frustration. It's not a government policy. It's millions of individual decisions adding up into real, measurable pressure on American exporters who built their business models around a neighbor that used to buy without hesitation. So when the White House talks about a trade deficit with Canada as a national emergency, which is literally the language U.S., Trade Representative Jamieson Greer used in front of a Senate committee, it's worth remembering that the same imbalance the U.S. is trying to fix through tariffs is also being fixed in the opposite direction by Canadians simply choosing not to buy American anymore. Every dollar redirected from a U.S. brand to a Canadian one is a dollar that doesn't come back just because a deal eventually gets signed. What makes this moment different from earlier rounds of the trade war is the tone coming out of Ottawa. Carney has explicitly said this is not the time to change course, and that Canada should be ready to get tougher in the days leading up to the deadline if a deal isn't reached. That's not the language of a government preparing to cave. Behind the scenes, according to multiple sources close to the negotiations, Canada and the U.S. have been trading detailed proposals, with Ottawa reportedly willing to make some concessions on things like procurement and select tariff categories, in exchange for real relief on steel and aluminum tariffs specifically. But sources on both sides describe the situation as fluid, unsettled, and still capable of falling apart entirely. Two sources close to the talks say Trump himself has not signed off on anything currently on the table, which means LeBlanc and Charette, Canada's chief trade negotiator, could spend weeks building something in Washington that gets blown up by a single social media post. That instability is exactly why Canada isn't offering blanket surrender. You don't hand over your best cards to a dealer who might walk away from the table mid-hand. If no deal is reached, here's what kicks in. Section 338 of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a piece of trade law from 1930 dusted off for this exact purpose, authorizes an additional 50% tariff on the targeted Canadian goods. Alcohol, dairy, electronics, roughly $20 billion in Canadian exports hit all at once, on top of tariffs that are already in place on autos, steel, aluminum, and lumber. Greer has described these specific tariffs as very tailored, framing them as a direct response to Canadian retaliatory measures on American alcohol, dairy, and autos. In other words, this isn't a blanket trade war escalation. It's targeted retaliation for Canada's own retaliation, a tit-for-tat spiral that's been building for 18 months with no clean off-ramp in sight. But here's what's easy to miss in the noise. Even after July 1st's non-renewal, even with all this brinkmanship, the broader tariff carve-out for goods that comply with existing USMCA rules of origin is still in place. Most Canadian and Mexican exports are still crossing the border duty-free under those rules. Nothing has technically collapsed yet. What's collapsing is trust the assumption that this relationship runs on predictable rules rather than presidential mood swings. It's not just Ottawa and the White House talking past each other. There's a whole layer of this fight playing out with American voices, too. And it complicates the simple story of the U.S. versus Canada. Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, a state that shares hundreds of miles of border and a deep agricultural relationship with Canada, has been meeting directly with LeBlanc and Charette during their Washington trips. And he said publicly that the talks have gotten more serious in recent weeks. Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee has been in those rooms too. These aren't fringe voices. They're sitting U.S. senators whose states depend on smooth cross-border trade, quietly working the phones, because a trade war with Canada doesn't just hurt Canadians, it hurts farmers in the Dakotas, manufacturers in Michigan, and exporters in states that voted for the very administration imposing these tariffs. LeBlanc has also sat down with Jay Timmons, head of the National Association of Manufacturers, representing companies that rely on exactly the kind of integrated supply chains these tariffs threaten to choke off. When American industry groups are lobbying alongside Canadian negotiators, that tells you something about where the real economic pain is landing. Meanwhile, back home, the mood is different, but just as telling. Online, in comment sections under every article about these negotiations, you'll find ordinary Canadians pushing their own government to hold the line even harder, telling Carney not to fold on dairy, not to fold on procurement, not to fold on anything, tariffs or no tariffs. There's a real political cost to compromise right now, and Carney knows it. A government that came to power promising a tougher stance can't turn around and quietly hand over the dairy sector without a fight, not without paying for it at the ballot box. That's the environment this deal is being negotiated in, not a boardroom, a pressure cooker on both sides of a border that used to feel more like a formality than a fault line. Strip away the tariff numbers and the deadline countdown, and what you're actually watching is a fundamental test of the Canada-U.S. relationship as it's existed for 80 years. For decades, the operating assumption on both sides of the border was that these two countries were basically stuck with each other, economically inseparable, politically aligned, culturally intertwined enough that a real lasting rupture was basically unthinkable. That assumption is being stress-tested in real time. And what's remarkable is how calmly Canada has responded to it. Not with panic, not with a rush to concede everything just to make the tariff threat go away, but with a prime minister standing at an aluminum plant saying, essentially, we'll take a comprehensive deal or we'll take nothing. And either way, we're not selling out our dairy farmers, our province's authority, or our ability to manage our own foreign relationships just because Washington set a clock running. For a country that spent generations being characterized sometimes fondly, sometimes dismissively, as polite, accommodating, easy to overlook, this is a genuinely different posture, whether it holds all the way to August 19th, whether a comprehensive deal actually materializes, or whether Canada ends up absorbing another round of tariffs while it waits Washington out. That's still an open question. But the headline holds either way. Canada was handed a set of new rules, a shrinking clock, and a neighbor that publicly said it doesn't even want the old deal back. And instead of folding, Canada said, not on those terms. That's the story unfolding right now. 3 weeks out from a deadline that either resets the entire Canada-US relationship or confirms that it's already been reset, whether either country is fully ready for it or not. If you found this useful, stick around because whatever happens on August 19th, it's going to reshape how these two countries do business with each other for years to come. And we'll be here to break down exactly what it means the moment it happens.